Here's the second point on that. David Brooks, the New York Times legendary conservative columnist, although now they have Ross Douthat, has left the New York Times as one of their most distinguished editorialists and controversial. He's much beloved and much maligned by people largely based on partisan affiliation, and he is moving full-time to The Atlantic and Yale University, which is sponsoring a podcast with The Atlantic. So get this. At the towering peak of your career as a legacy Washington, D.C. and New York journalist, what do you want to do today when you grow up? You want to become a podcaster. That's right, folks. The adults today are copying the kids, and this is savvy. To the extent that the New York Times, the New Yorker, and every legacy media outlet has any chance of being relevant, it is because they are copying the new media forms. They call podcasting essentially what is used to be called television. But they don't really know what podcasting is. And that's okay, because the word now is anything that you want. But podcasting is actually a form of informal discourse and dialogue. And to the extent that shows move away from this, they don't replicate the energy of podcasts. Doesn't mean they can't be successful television shows, but it's a challenge. This is why legacy media, in spite of adopting new media, is still struggling to grow. There are some exceptions, but if you had to put bets on will the New York Times be very relevant in 10 years, well, I know which side I would be betting. So, first point, the new media are what old media are copying to stay relevant. Second point, it's not actually easy to do that because the old legacy media have patterns, both in their editorial offices and the way they think about news, that don't fit new media. Here's the third point. The biggest pattern of legacy media that new media challenges is what's often called narrative news. This is essentially imposing a perspective over the arc of all of your coverage in order to produce a consistent ethos in your readers or viewers. We know what this means. In a partisan context, it means you have a consistent representation of a partisan perspective. You would think if news were actually disinterested reporting, fundamentally concerned with finding the truth, that you would have a diversity of outlook. But of course, you know in the New York Times what position it's going to take on a Republican or right-wing issue 99% of the time. And you know in the case of Fox News what position it's going to take on any given issue. So this kind of narrative newsmaking is essentially the imposition of a structure, essentially what people would call an ideology. And I want to be very precise here. It is very close to what Marx calls an ideology. An ideology for a Marxist is the unconscious effect of an economic incentive structure, what Marxists call the substructure of culture. So if you have extensive financial support, primarily from a certain group of political, partisan perspective people, then you will need to tailor your news to their assumptions. At the same time, in order to give them a sense of novelty, you will seek to actively shape their assumptions. So essentially, the news is a way of reinforcing prejudice and maintaining a market share on the pretext of discussing current events. This is why you can watch the nightly news or read the New York Times for 20 years and still not know where Iran is on a map. These institutions, as interesting and valuable as they are in their own right economically, are not fundamentally about education.